All right, this is the first of 3 brief videos on oil. We're going to talk about U.S. and global use and who has it, who uses it, and peak oil today. Okay. So, oil currently supplies about 40% of the world's energy. The global demand for energy in general has tripled in about the last 50 years and is expected to double in the next 30 years or so. By 2025, the developing world will use more energy than the developed world. Much of the increased demand will also come from continued use in the United States, but especially China and India, 2 rapidly developing nations. Right. So 84% of all petroleum is used for transportation in the form of either gasoline, diesel, ethanol, or propane. But oil is also used as the feedstock for making plastics, agricultural fertilizers, some pharmaceuticals, and textiles, the different polypropylene and rayon fabrics that we like. It's used in cosmetics. It's used in the food industry. I always tell people never buy these soft batch cookies because those have plasticizers in them to keep them soft. So you're essentially eating petroleum. And it's also used in pesticides and to make asphalt. Right. So there's a number of different ways that we talk about oil reserves. Conventional oil reserves are those that we have previously obtained via drilling in far west Texas, in places in Alaska, across the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait are all big conventional oil drilling countries. In about the last 40 years, we've started obtaining oil from a number of new sources that we'll talk about. Tar sands, primarily in Canada, are obtained via surface mining. Shale oil and natural gas reserves across the United States and some other countries are obtained via hydraulic fracturing, which we'll talk about, and oil held in hard rock formations, especially in the United States. There's also deep sea drilling. All of these, though, are far more expensive and difficult to extract than conventional oil reserves. All right, so post-World War II history, and this is particularly important for the United States politically. World War II was the first mechanized war that was driven by fossil fuels. And what the world learned was that the nation that has the oil, that has the energy resources, will win the war. So after the World War II, the Western world, especially the United States, rapidly industrialized, driven by fossil fuels. Because of that, prior to World War II, the United States produced as much or more oil than we used. After World War II, there were a number of different shifts where U.S. petroleum use began to exceed production. A couple of important reasons for that. One, the baby boom that happened after World War II prompted a big move to the suburbs, which led to people driving more. Prior to this, people tended to live more in cities where there was more public transportation or the ability to walk places was more available. But the suburbs really began to grow after World War II. And as we all know, if you live in the suburbs, you need a car. In World War II, more women began to work. As the soldiers were away fighting the war, the women often were the people staffing the factories that made the things that were needed to run a war. Like canteens, munitions, things like this. So after World War II, while some women returned to the earlier society traditional mode of staying at home and raising children, a lot of women decided to stay in the workforce. When you have more women in the workforce, what you need is more cars. So we began to see two-car families. You also have more family income. Working women need convenience items, so things like washing machines and clothes dryers really started to emerge after World War II. And of course, nowadays we have microwave ovens, dishwashers, and a lot of modern conveniences that make normal household chores a lot less time consuming, which again, working women, working families need. A little bit before World War II, the interstate highway system began to grow very rapidly, and what this did is it allowed for more travel. And when you have more family income, you also get more family vacations, so people driving across the country more to see things. We also saw the growth of the airline industry. Prior to World War II, people did not fly places. It was very uncommon. After World War II, up to the modern times, the airline industry began to grow very rapidly, and flying for business and vacation grew rapidly. So because of this, the United States began to become a net importer of oil. And of course, where we looked first, because the biggest oil reserves pre-World War II and during World War II were found in Middle Eastern nations, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iran, Iraq, United Arab Emirates. So the United States began to become more involved in the Middle East in a desire to control and have access to these oil reserves. And we'll talk about this a little bit too. Okay. So if we go back only as far as 2008 and look at which country has oils, the important thing to notice is Saudi Arabia is way up at the top with far more oil reserves than any other nation. Canada is up there because of the Athabasca tar sands that we'll talk about. The important thing to notice is how far down the United States is on this list and how far down Russia is on this list, and how much less oil we produce than countries like Saudi Arabia. We say that because now, if we fast forward to 2016, the metric that's measured on this table is different than the one from 2008. That's okay. The important thing to notice is that the United States has now moved up to the number 3 country in the world in terms of oil production. Notice that Russia has also greatly moved up. In the United States, this is greatly due to hydraulic fracturing that we'll talk about. In Russia, it's due to exploitation of Arctic oil and Siberian oil reserves. Okay. So notable differences. The United States grew rapidly in our oil production. The reason for this is hydraulic fracturing technology has really developed over about the last 2 decades, especially horizontal drilling that allows us to access a lot of oil reserves trapped in hard rock formations via only a few vertical drills. Again, Russia surpassed Saudi Arabia as number 1 because there's Siberian oil reserves. A lot of this is now more accessible due to global climate change, Arctic drilling, oil sands, and Russia also does hydraulic fracturing just like the United States. Okay. Now, if we look at oil consumption by country, okay, what we will see is on a per capita basis, the United States and Canada are 2 of the biggest per person oil consumers in the world. We'll talk a little bit about this because if you compare us to the developing world, so countries like China and India, what you'll see is that our oil use per person is much higher. One would expect this. But if we compare the United States and Canada to other Western countries like Germany, South Korea, and France that also have very high living standards, are also industrialized countries, we still see that our per person use is very high. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Okay. So, this tells us a number of things. The U.S. now produces a lot of oil because of hydraulic fracturing, but we also use a lot of oil. Industrialized countries, so the United States, Canada, South Korea, Japan, European nations like Germany and France, use a lot more energy per person than non-industrialized ones. But countries that are rapidly industrializing, like China and India, are starting to catch up to the industrialized ones. Now, why is this? Well, energy drives industrialization because all of the different manufacturing facilities rely on energy to work. Industrialization provides good jobs. Good jobs raise living standards and build strong economies, which then create a market for the products that the industries are making. Now, as I said before, the United States and Canada use more energy per person than European countries. I always use an example, Germany, because I've traveled there quite a bit, so I'm more familiar with Germany than most other European countries. If you go to Germany, they are also an industrialized nation. They also have very high living standards that we are used to here in the United States. But there's a couple of key differences as to why we use a lot more energy per person than they do. Number one, we're physically bigger. To travel from one side of Germany to the other side of Germany is hundreds of miles. Okay? To travel from one side of the United States to the other side of the United States can be thousands of miles. So we have much longer travel distances between major cities and states. So whether you're traveling by air or traveling by car, it's going to take you more fuel to go a longer distance. Europe has a lot more public transportation. If you go to Germany, they have tram systems and subway systems, both in major cities. They also have a very high-speed transportation rail that goes between cities. Because of that, and because gasoline and car ownership are a lot more expensive in Europe than they are in the United States, people tend to use the public transportation a lot more. It's very, very convenient in Germany to use public transportation compared to a city like Green Bay. In the United States, people live in the suburbs and commute into the city and work. And of course, if you live in Green Bay, what you know is a lot of the bus lines don't go out to the suburbs, and we don't have a tram or rail service within the city. So that means if we live in the suburbs in the United States, we have to drive into the city, drive to get to our jobs. In Germany and European countries, people live in the inner city. So you can get from where you live to grocery stores, to other shops, to where you work via public transportation or even walking quite easily. In the United States, people drive much bigger cars. If you were to go to Germany, and I was there for a couple of months back in 2011, what you see is a lot of cars like a Ford Focus. In the United States, you see a lot of SUVs that you're just not going to see in Europe. So more fuel efficient car, less fuel used. And part of this is because they pay almost 4 times for gasoline what we pay in the United States. So they tend to use it far more conservatively. Okay. Now if we look at oil exporting countries in 2011, as we see, Saudi Arabia is the #1 oil exporter. And up till about the year 2000, 2010, the United States imported more oil from Saudi Arabia than from any other country. Surprisingly now, the United States imports more oil from Canada than any other country, and we'll talk about the tar sands. So what we see in terms of oil exporting countries, the most important thing to see here is that the United States is not on that list. So even though we do generate more oil via hydraulic fracturing than we used to, we are still an oil importing country. All of the countries with the asterisks by them are OPEC countries, which stands for Organization of Oil Exporting Countries. And we'll talk about them a little bit later. Okay. If we look at oil importing countries in 2011, again, even though the United States is a bigger producer of oil, we are still the biggest oil importing country globally, followed by China, who imports a lot of their oil from Russia and Japan, India, and a lot of European countries. Okay. So what does this tell us? We still import a lot of oil in the United States despite our increased production. Most global exports are still from OPEC countries. And European countries are also dependent on foreign oil. Surprisingly, not surprisingly, European countries import from the Middle East, but they also import some oil and natural gas from Russia. China also imports a lot of oil from Russia. And India and Japan are dependent upon Middle Eastern and other oil exporting countries. So as I said, interesting fact, Saudi Arabia used to be the main country that the United States imported oil from after World War II. That's why you'll notice that different U.S. presidents have had some interesting relationships with Middle Eastern countries, especially Saudi Arabia. We'll talk about that in another lecture. But since about 2010, the United States now imports more oil from Canada than any other country. Okay. So when we talk about oil, one of the things we talk about is peak oil. And it's the time when the maximum rate of extraction is reached. For conventional drilling, the actual first U.S. peak oil was around 1973, but hydraulic fracturing, also called fracking, has moved this to the near future. Globally, again, peak oil via conventional sources has already been reached, but because of Arctic oil, hydraulic fracturing, tar sand, shale oil, and other resources, peak oil has shifted again to the near future.